Our speaker tonight is B.J. Schaefer. B.J. is a native of Lawrence County and graduated from LTHS and then went on and got his degree in electrical engineering, I believe, at the University of Illinois. Veteran of the U.S. Navy, but for purposes of our program tonight, he worked in the space program during, I guess, what we would say its heyday, from about the early 60s through the end in about 1973, and worked at the George Marshall Space Center in Huntsville, Alabama. And so he's been kind enough to come tonight and talk about his experiences there and the space program in general, and I suppose in particular the Apollo 11 moon missions. So please welcome B.J. Schaefer.
Thank you. Before I get started on the presentation, I was going to suggest that Bill Richardson there make a correction in the article he wrote announcing this tonight, because it was something I didn't think was quite right. But Mike Neal tells me he's the one that told him that. So but anyway,
you got to rely on your sources.
Yeah, that's what I said. But I didn't want you to be, today's environment, I didn't want you to be accused of putting false news out, fake news out there, Bill. But he said that I had worked closely with Wernher von Braun on the Apollo program in the development of the Saturn rockets. Von Braun was at that time the director of the Marshall Space Flight Center down in Huntsville, Alabama, which developed and did the rocket. But I was a manager in engineering at that time for one of the major contractors of Marshall, and was quite a few links down the ladder from Wernher von Braun. But if you wanted to say that making a few presentations at meetings where von Braun was present, or every now and then walking into the office building where his offices were, was working closely with him, I guess you could say I did. But in reality, I knew who he was and had made a few presentations in front of him, but I can't say I worked closely with him. However, as a major contractor, we did work very closely with his team at Marshall in the development of the Apollo rockets. The big rockets were developed at Marshall, the spacecrafts at Houston. But anyway, with that, let's get on with it here. I guess most of you lately, with the television being going like it has the last few weeks, are pretty well aware that this is 50 years ago this month, the man first walked on the moon. July 20th, 1967 at 9:56 p.m. in the afternoon. Completely amazing at the coincidence that happened right in prime time on Sunday night when everybody could watch it. And that was in the day, and in fact, the whole world apparently did watch it. They still say it's the most watched television program in history. And that's when a lot of people didn't have televisions. But for an old guy like me, who a whole lot of things doesn't seem like it'd be possible it could happen that long ago, it's hard for me to believe that 50 years has gone by since that happened. And even more harder for me to believe is the fact that in those 50 years we have never been back. Because at the time they canceled that program, we were working on scientific stations on the moon and rockets to go to Mars. And any of us would have bet our lives that within a few years we would do both, and by now doing either one would be kind of a commonplace happening. I would have never believed that we've never been back since then. But anyway, I also can't believe that people under 50 years old can't remember it, but weren't even born yet. But as Mike says, I see there's a few of you here that probably can remember it. And by the way, excuse me for looking at the notes, when you get my age, your memory's not such that you dare do something without a few primers once in a while. Okay, Cindy, next slide. This is, of course, John Kennedy. Okay. I always used to ask when they're here, who was the first people to go to the moon? Does anybody know who the first people to go to the moon were? The names of them?
Neil Armstrong, right?
Now, actually, that's the answer you usually get, but that's not right.
No?
Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins were the 9th, 10th, and 11th people to go to the moon. The first people to go to the moon was Borman, Anders, and Lovell. And if you all remember, they went to the moon, circled the moon, Christmas Eve in 1968, about 7 months before the astronauts actually walked on the moon. They read Bible verses on Christmas Eve on television, if you remember, and showed these pictures of the Earthrise over the moon. That's the Earth rising and the moon. They took that picture when they were up there. Whenever I usually ask people questions like that, or ask them what Apollo was, most of them are going to say the moon landing. That's what they remember. And TV gave most of their coverage to the launches and the landings and the astronauts. Not very much on what was done. But Apollo was a lot. Those launches and landings were the objective, and that's what the results were. But Apollo itself was a whole lot more than that, the Apollo program. It was the largest engineering program that's ever been done in the history of the world. And it also was a major computer development program. At the time we started Apollo, computers, if you was going to use a computer, you sat down and either in COBOL or Fortran, usually Fortran, you wrote out your program that you wanted, you took it down to key punch, and they key punched it on a bunch of IBM cards. That night you gave it to computer people, they ran it into the computer, ran your program, gave you a printout the next morning, checked it, did this all over again. And it took hours to do it. And in fact, the cell phones that most of you've got in your pockets has more computing power in it than all the computers NASA and the contractors had at the time Apollo started. When Apollo was over, we had mini computers with big memories, CRTs displays, and keyboard inputs. But so it really moved the computer program. They estimate that Apollo advanced computers by 20 years to what they would have been developed if it hadn't been for Apollo. It also, as I said, was a major engineering program. There was thousands of engineers working on that program. There was 10,000 engineers in Huntsville alone. Now, a lot of people, when they say rockets in the space program, they say rocket scientists. There wasn't very many scientists that worked on Apollo. It was engineers and engineering programs. It was people from Louisiana State, Georgia Tech, Auburn, Illinois, Purdue, California Polytechnical Institute, engineering schools, not Ivy League or MIT or those places that generate scientists. They also estimate that at the peak of the Apollo program in the mid-1960s, late 1960s, there was 400,000 people working on Apollo one way or another, full across the United States, 400,000. Okay, Cindy, go to the next one. Okay, that's Armstrong coming down on the moon. That's what most people remember Apollo as being. But as I was saying, TV pretty much concentrated on what was done on the launches and the landings. Tonight, I'm going to talk more about how we did it and not what we did. I'll talk a little bit about it. I'll also tell you, bore you a little bit maybe, with some of my personal experiences working on the program, and at the end kind of show you some of the memorabilia I've gathered up over the years when I was working on it. Okay, Cindy, next slide. That is the Saturn V launching. As you can see, that's one big rocket, and I'll tell you how big it is in a little bit. But a lot of people will ask, when you ask people, who did Apollo, they're going to say NASA. And when I say I worked on Apollo, almost everybody says, oh, you worked for NASA, right? And I have to say, no, I didn't work for NASA. I worked for General Electric Company. Okay, Cindy, go to NASA. NASA funded the program, and they managed it, but contractors did all the work. The work was really done by the contractors. If you look at this, let's see, get that working. This right here is the first stage of the Apollo. And that's the S-1C, and that was designed and did by the Boeing company. This is the second stage, the S-2. It was designed and built by North American Rockwell. This is the third stage. That's the S-4B, and it was designed by Douglas. At that time, it was Douglas Aviation, not McDonnell Douglas. They hadn't merged yet. This little area right in here was the instrument unit, and that particular part was where all the computers, instrumentation, etc., that controlled and operated this whole rocket was located. That was done by IBM. And up here, from here up, is the spacecraft. This right in here, that spacecraft and the booster rockets and stuff that went with what's called the service module. That was all done by North American. And the lunar excursion module, which was in a shroud right down here that they picked up later, was done by Grumman out of New York City. The big engines on all these big engines on here were all done and developed by Rocketdyne. Now, in addition, a whole lot of other stuff was done by smaller operations and smaller companies and all kinds of things. There was another rocket that was used, a big rocket, that was used as part of the program. That was called the Saturn 1B, and that was done with Chrysler Corporation. And we at GE did all the ground support equipment, electrical equipment that tested, checked out, and launched these launch vehicles. And that's basically what I worked on. Okay, Cindy, go to the next one. This is that equipment. These consoles, you see these people sitting at. This is the launch complex that launched the missiles at Cape Kennedy. We at GE designed and built all this equipment that you see them sitting at there. Now, in addition to that, we had 2 huge computers, for that time at least, and a whole bunch of other test equipment and stuff down in the basement of this launch complex that these things were just the interface to. And then we had another big computer on the mobile launcher out at the pads that connected us to the rocket. Those computers talk back and forth to each other. So anytime anybody did anything here, they would go into a computer, the computer would go to another computer, and then that would go to the rocket. So that's the way we did it. Okay, when GE first got these, before they got these contracts, GE was given a contract to provide engineering support to Marshall down at both at Houston and at the Cape and at Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville. The reason for that was that NASA just couldn't get their hands on enough engineers, and GE had a huge pool of engineers. So that's how I got on the program, in fact. The first job I had when I got there in early 1962, which is when the program was just getting started, I came there as a design engineer, designing vehicle simulators to simulate these big rockets that I was showing a while ago for the ground equipment and stuff to use, to test them, to train crews, to develop the software, etc., so they didn't have to use the big rockets, which they didn't really have yet then anyway. So then later on, we got those contracts to do the ground support. We also did all the ground support equipment and checkout equipment for the spacecraft itself. And we did the stuff at the for Marshall, at the Cape in Marshall, because Marshall was very parochial and they wouldn't let us do it anyplace else. And the stuff for Houston and every place else we did at Daytona Beach. Factory GE built a big complex at Daytona Beach, and engineering and factories was right across the street from the Daytona Beach racetracks, and we used to go sit on the roof of the building during the Daytona 500, have parties and watch the races for free from the top of the factories. Okay, kids, so next one. Okay, in May of 1961, Kennedy made his speech that said we wanted to go to the moon in 1961, to go to the moon in the 1960s, and we was going to do it not because it was easy, but because it was hard. Well, when he said hard, he didn't have any idea how hard it was really going to be. Because when NASA, at the time he said he was going to do that, NASA literally had nothing to do that program with. Absolutely, practically nothing. The reason they picked the moon landing was when Kennedy got elected, he called a bunch of scientists and people together and said, the space race was going in. He said, what can we do that we can beat the Russians at? And Wernher von Braun said, we can go to the moon. And the reason we can beat the Russians at the moon is the rockets they've got aren't big enough to get to the moon, and we can develop rockets faster than they can. And that's how Kennedy picked that idea. Now, NASA was, as I said, they were really a grand deal. So they had to just do everything from the ground up. And as people went to work on it, did the same thing, because I can tell you when we first got there, you couldn't go to a textbook or a reference book and see how you wanted to do something. You had to figure it out for yourself. You had to figure it, because you were doing it the first time it had ever been done. And but at NASA did have a small group of engineers at Goddard Spacecraft Center up near Washington, D.C. that was working on the Mercury program, which again was us trying to catch up with the Russians in the space race. And they had that small group. They were also going to use an Atlas rocket, which was a rocket that the Air Force had, an intercontinental ballistic missile. They were going to use that, and they were going to use the launch pads and stuff at Cape Kennedy, which was again Air Force pads, but they had nothing themselves. And in fact, von Braun, who led the development of those rockets, and was the was the director of the Marshall Center, wasn't even working for NASA at that time. Him and his group of Germans were working at the Army Missile Command for the U.S. Army at Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville. Okay, so next up. Okay, that's Sputnik. That's what caused all this. That's what kicked the space race off. Russia launched that, and it was a huge propaganda victory for them. Everybody saw it in the papers. I can remember I was going to college at the University of Illinois at that point in time. I was working in the daytime and going to school at night with the GI Bill. And when the Sputnik was scheduled to go over, the professor would let class out. We'd go stand in the quadrangle and watch it go over, a little deeper in the sky. But everyone thought that the Russians got worried about the Russian rockets, because they figured if they could put a satellite up there, they could put bombs in the United States, and everybody got worried about it. The military really played it up, because they were using it to get funds to fund the programs they had going. Technically, if you really looked at it, we really weren't behind the Russians. We just hadn't decided to do anything, and they did. Von Braun, in fact, would have been able to launch a satellite into orbit a year before the Russians ever launched theirs. They had fired a rocket out of the Cape that reached speeds that would have put it into orbit if they'd aimed it that way. And in fact, Eisenhower wouldn't let them do it. That's why they didn't do it. He didn't want the military to be involved with space. In fact, if you remember, he negotiated a treaty with the Russians to demilitarize space. And in fact, he got to worry that they might go ahead and do it anyway, so he sent a team down to Huntsville, Redstone Arsenal at that time, to check to see if they were down there building satellites. And one of the Germans, they had a satellite, and one of the Germans put it in the trunk of his Mercedes and hauled it around back and forth to home, so those guys from Eisenhower couldn't find it to find out they had it. The other big reason that Eisenhower didn't want them to do it, he had been in charge of the military, of course, in World War II, and he knew that von Braun and most of those Germans that were working down there were ex-Nazis, and he did not want them doing that program for the United States. However, when the heat really got down on him and the press got so excited, everybody got so excited about it, he went ahead and turned them loose, and within 3 months after he told them to go, they put a satellite up. Much better satellite than what the Germans had. In fact, it was a satellite that discovered the von Braun radiation belt around the Earth. The Russian satellite didn't do nothing but beep when he went around. They didn't do nothing else. Okay, Cindy. So as I said, we had to start from scratch. This is a picture here of the George Marshall Space Flight Center. And all these buildings, this is a big Saturn rocket, matter of fact, right there laying on the side. You can see, kind of get a perspective how big it is with these buildings. These are multi-stored office buildings and stuff here. But all the office buildings, laboratories, etc., they had to build those from scratch. They weren't there when that program started. They built it on the Redstone Arsenal where von Braun and those guys were, because there was a lot of space there, and all that rocket team was there and they didn't want to leave, so they built it in Huntsville. In fact, that George Marshall Space Flight Center started out in an abandoned cotton mill. NASA leased that cotton mill, stripped the insides out of it, and put offices in it and laboratories. In fact, that's where I first started to work. When I first went to Huntsville, we went to work in an abandoned cotton mill. And in fact, there was a railroad that went by that cotton mill, and when it would go by, it would shake it like railroads do, and you'd be sitting at your desk, and a train would go by, and little flakes of nits of cotton would come floating out of the ceiling and land on your desk. So they had to build all this buildings. Now, in addition to Marshall, they built Houston Center, because what they had at Goddard just wasn't big enough, and also the politics got involved in it. Now, if you notice, if you've ever looked at it, almost all the NASA facilities are in the South. And the reason they were in the South was that the congressmen at that time and the senators that had control of all the money were all from the South. Guys like Johnson, who was the head of the Senate at one time, but by then was vice president, Sam Rayburn from Texas, John Sparkman from Alabama, a senator and running for vice president. That's how Redstone, von Braun got to Redstone. He brought them from Texas up there. They were down in Texas. Earl Long out of Louisiana, Wilbur Mills out of Arkansas, and a guy named Thomas, who was a representative from the area where Houston is at. He had control of the budget for the House Appropriations Committee, and he advised NASA if they didn't build a center in Houston, Texas, in his district, he wasn't going to approve the money for them. So they built it in Texas. But down at Cape Canaveral, they did build a facility down there for a good reason, and not really from politics. The Cape Canaveral happens to be the only place where you could launch a rocket out over the water, having no people underneath it if it happens to blow up or anything fall down, and yet it's got a whole chain of islands all the way down the range that you can put test and radar and tracking stations on to track and find out how your rocket's doing. That tracking range goes down through the Bahamas, down through the Leeward Islands, past Trinidad, and all the way to Ascension Island down in South America. In fact, when I was in the Navy, I worked on those tracking stations. That's how I ended up getting in this program in the first place. Okay, so but again, just as you go to that next slide, I forgot to put Houston up there. This is Houston here. All these buildings and stuff, they built from scratch. They weren't there. They were out in the Tidewater region south of Houston, these little lakes and stuff, so they drained the land so they could build that stuff out there. Again, they built all the, and also here they built the control center that controls and monitors and handles all the spacecraft after it goes out of orbit towards the moon. Okay, next one, Cindy. This is, again, the new launch complex we built. They built at Merritt Island. Merritt Island is north of the Cape. At that time, it was a big bird sanctuary, and they built that whole center out there. They built all the offices and stuff that you can see in various places. They built this big launch assembly building, the vertical assembly building. This is where they assemble the rockets when they got all the pieces down there to launch them. It's also, this thing had to be earthquake proof. I'll talk about that a little bit later. This is what we call the mobile launcher. This is how they moved that rocket from this building, so it normally was in one of these bays here, out to the pad so they could launch it. They also built the Launch Control Center, which is what that is right there. That's the Launch Control Center where they actually tested and launched the vehicle from. Okay, as I said, they built these big mobile launchers. Okay, so the next page. At the time, before I got on the Apollo program, I was working on the Atlas program for the Air Force. This is the Atlas right there. The reason I show this is I want to talk some about that a little bit. I was working on that Atlas program as a guidance system engineer, and we were launching spy satellites to keep an eye on the Russians out of Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. When GE got the contracts for Marshall, they agreed to supply engineers to help support them, but they said they would get engineers who had at least 5 years experience working with rockets. And in 1962, there wasn't very many of us. So they went through the personnel files, my name come up. They asked me if I'd like to go to Huntsville. I first thought, where the heck's Huntsville? And then it dawned on me it was the Redstone Arsenal. If Redstone Arsenal was Apollo, and in those days, if you were working on rockets, you wanted to be on the Apollo program. So I went. It was kind of interesting when I got to Huntsville. Huntsville was really starting to boom. When Huntsville started out, it was a little cotton milling town of about 20,000. When they moved the Germans out of Texas up to the Redstone Arsenal, which had been at that time was an abandoned ammunition plant from World War II that happened to be there near Huntsville, it grew up to about 60,000. When I got to Huntsville, that's what it was, about 60,000. At the time I left, it was 300,000. 10 years later, and today it's up over 400,000. And when we got there, I was married. Me and the wife, we had 2 small kids, one of them 2 years old, and the other one in diapers, 2 small boys. There was no housing available in Huntsville. If you wanted a house, you had to build it. And if they built a house, it took 3 months to get it. GE knew this was going to happen, so they had rented a whole block of rooms at the Holiday Inn in Huntsville, Alabama. We moved into 1 motel room, me and the wife and the 2 babies, and we were there for almost 3 months. I really felt for my wife being cooped up in a single motel room for almost 3 months with 2 babies. But it was really interesting. We weren't by ourselves. The whole place was full of people like us. And when you go out around the swimming pool during the day, it looked like a nursery school out there. All these little kids running around. But that's how we got it started. This particular But this was the biggest, hottest thing the United States had at that time. It had 3 engines in it that ran on liquid oxygen fuel. Okay, Cindy, next one. Well, we finally got designs going, got it underway. This is a picture of the first rocket they designed. This is called a Saturn 1B, and it's a big rocket booster with 8 engines. And this top part here is what they call the S4B. That one later was also used on the Saturn V. This rocket was designed to put components that we were going to use on Apollo into Earth orbit to test them, verify them, make sure they worked, etc. To give you an idea of size, this whole thing, this is the gantry that they launched the Saturn V's from, this mobile launcher here. From here to here was the Saturn V rocket. This particular rocket I'm showing here was what we used to launch Skylab with. And by then they had closed the complexes that we had normally launched these from, and we built this scaffold from that mobile launcher up to that to support it, so we could tie in where the S4B normally was, and we put new equipment here to use what the S2 had used. And all this down here was where the first part of the Saturn was. So this gives you kind of how big that Saturn rocket really was compared to this one. This particular rocket had 8 engines on it, and it's really, if you can't really see it too good here, but they really took all the tanks and the engines from 8 of the Army's Jupiter missiles, strapped them all together, and built this rocket. And this rocket had, this is the way we measured how big rockets were, had 1.5 million pounds of thrust. The Atlas I showed you just before, which is the best intercontinental mission, had 100,000 pounds of thrust. So this thing was, by itself, is 15 times bigger than what we'd ever had before. You've probably seen this rocket if you've ever gone from Nashville south on I-65. Just you cross into Alabama, there's a rest area. There's one of those standing up there. That's the Saturn 1B you see standing there alongside the road. Okay, so next one. This, again, this is the Saturn V. As I said, this is the first stage. This is S1C. Now, to give you a comparison, I said that other rocket had 1.5 million. This has 7.5 million pounds of thrust, just this first stage. They say that if you converted that thrust, 7.5 million pounds of thrust, to horsepower and compared it, it would take a string of diesel engines that would reach from Seattle, Washington to Chicago to equal that amount of horsepower. That's how much this thing. When this whole thing went off the ground, it weighed over 60,000 tons. That was bigger than a World War II heavy cruiser. This is the S2 stage. This one here, by the way, this one here burned RP1, which is juiced up kerosene, and liquid oxygen to make it burn. This was the S2 stage. This one just got it all this off the ground and got it going. The S2 stage, once it actually got out of the atmosphere, they used this to get it up to the speed and get it up to orbital height to go into orbit. It burned hydrogen and liquid oxygen. This is the S4B stage. It was what gave it the kick to put it into orbit, and also to give it the kick, the spacecraft the kick to take it to the moon. The engines on this was unique in that they were restartables. First one we'd ever been able to restart. Normally once you fired a rocket engine, it was done. And then of course up here is the spacecraft itself. This is up here, the spacecraft. This engine on the spacecraft and this, what they call the service module, that was the engine that took the spacecraft, which this is the Apollo craft itself. It took it to the moon and give it the thrust to go around the moon. It also was what they used to slow it down so that it would go into orbit, which I'll talk about a little bit later on. But also in this service module, which became a problem in Apollo 13, was all the oxygen, electrical, fuel cells that generate electricity, etc., that supplied the Apollo spacecraft. But anyway, when they got these things designed started, along with that S1B I showed you earlier, it became obvious that they were too big to be transported by land or by rail. There was no way to move them by land or rail. They were too big. So what they did was design barges to move them. Marshall Space Flight Center was on the Tennessee River, so they built barges. And that Saturn 1B, they put it on a barge, took it down the river. The S4B, the part up here in the spacecraft, were small enough they could fly those as aircraft. Okay, next one. There's the barges that they designed to haul these things. As I said, the S-1B went in one of these barges. They took it down the Tennessee River to the Ohio River, down the Mississippi River to the Gulf of Mexico, across the Gulf of Mexico. The original idea was to go around Florida, up the East Coast, and to the Cape. First problem we ran into was, once they got the idea of what the barge was going to be, they wouldn't go through the locks and the dams on the Tennessee River. So they had to go down and they had to rebuild all those locks on the Tennessee River, from Huntsville all the way down to Kentucky Lake. That's part of, they had to redesign that, make them bigger so they could go through. The other problem they decided they got into, by then, Cuba had become communist, and we'd had the Cuban Missile Crisis. So they decided they really didn't want to take these rockets down near Cuba, which you did if you went around Key West, where the Russians and the Cubans were. And besides that, they was worried about storms, because they had a lot of storms in that Florida Strait. That's where happened to all the Spanish galleons that they're down there taking treasure off of now. So they built a canal right across the middle of Florida through Lake Okeechobee, so they could take that rockets across the Gulf, through the middle of Florida, back up the coast, and up to Cape Canaveral. Then they had to build a port in Cape Canaveral so they could unload them. And if you ever took a cruise out of Port Canaveral, the cruise ships sail out of the ports that they built to unload these barges for Apollo. Apollo built that port too. Okay, Cindy. This is the airplane they built to fly the S-4B and this is a spacecraft right here being loaded, matter of fact. All packed up so it don't get damaged. What they did was took an Army transport and made a huge fuselage on it so they could fly these things. They flew the Saturn 1B, the spacecraft, and they also flew the limbs in from New York and stuff. Everybody on the program called this a pregnant guppy. They thought it looked like a pregnant fish. But anyway, okay, next one, Cindy. This is a picture of the new engine that was developed for that Saturn V rocket. And this is being test fired. But as you can take a look at this and see the people standing here, that was one big engine. Across the bottom of it right here was about 15 feet. The engines you saw on those other rockets were only about 5 feet. So anyway, the way Marshall and really Apollo, everything they did, they tested it. And they tested it to death, really. If you build an engine, you test it before you put it on the rocket. If you build a rocket, you test the rocket before you flew it, et cetera, et cetera. This is a test firing. When they test fired this rocket for the first time, these test stands were down on the Redstone Arsenal, clear down on the far end of it. It was about 7 or 8 miles from that to the city of Huntsville. When they test fired that first one, we had a mini earthquake in Huntsville. The noise of that thing was so loud, I knew it was they were going to test fire it. They fired it in the evening after I was home from work. My house had a sliding glass door that looked out on a patio that looked down towards where they're going to launch that rocket from. I was standing in that sliding glass door to see if I could see the rocket launch and to hear how much noise it was going to make. And when that sound got to it almost shook my sliding glass door off its runners. I had to hold it to keep it from falling off. It broke a lot of windows all over the city of Huntsville at the time. So then they decided they really couldn't test the whole rocket with 5 of those things in Huntsville. So they went down in the swamps and bayous of southern Mississippi and built another facility down there just to test these rockets, the big ones. And as long as they were going to do the testing down there, they decided they might as well build a rocket down there. So they built a big facility at Michoud, right near Orleans, across Lake Pontchartrain from where this test facility was, to design and to build the S-1C rockets. And the other advantage they got, that it made it much shorter to transport those big barges that thing took. Okay, so the next shot. Okay, this is kind of a thing of the Cape to give you a few thoughts on that. These down here was Cape Kennedy, right here. This was Cape Kennedy, right down here. That's what it was. And this is where some of them were launched. These Mercury Atlases were launched from here. There's where the Cape Kennedy Lighthouse was. These were the old Redstone pads where we launched the first rockets we ever had. These 3 pads right in here, this pad right in here, this was the pads we used for the Saturn 1B, the early first ones. This is where they launched, SpaceX launches their stuff. This is where they launched some of those satellite stuff. This is the Launch Complex 39. There was originally going to be 3 of them. They decided they didn't never use the third one. We never got that far. So there's only built 2 of those. This is where the vertical assembly building is, and the launch complex, the control center and stuff. This is where you go if you go down there and go through to see the displays and stuff. That's where that is. From here to here is about 4 miles. And now they say this is where they had an observation gantry, and they really did, but they didn't do that much. And right in this area is where they had the viewing stands for the witnesses, people to watch the launches, this kind of thing. This vertical assembly building, they built it was hurricane proof, because somebody got to thinking, well, if we get out here on these pads with just a gantry around these great big rockets and a hurricane comes, we're going to have big trouble. So if a hurricane came, the plan was to take that mobile launcher, bring them back to this vertical assembly building and lock the doors on it. The doors on this, by the way, were the biggest moving doors that had ever been built in history. They ran on railroad tracks. This thing was about 400 feet high. And having been up to the top of it, when you got up to the top of that thing and looked down, I'm going to tell you, that was some sensation. I know my fingerprints are still on the rails up there, but I had to hold up and look down. I hung on tight. But anyway, as I said, this is about 3 miles. And the reason for that was, if you were within, in fact, it's about 4 miles. If you were within 3 miles when that Saturn V rocket went off and weren't protected, it would scramble your brain and kill you, the noise from it. So they couldn't get it going. In fact, some of you may remember when Walter Cronkite was broadcasting the first launch of a Saturn V rocket, they had their observation platforms in this area here. And CBS had built kind of a ramshackle building for their broadcast booth. Cronkite was sitting in it making that broadcast. And when that rocket launched, it shook CBS's press center down. And if you remember, the roof fell on Cronkite's head when he was making the broadcast. So it shook, it took him down. Also, this is the pads that they rolled that rocket out in on that big launcher, mobile launcher. And that launcher not only moved those rockets, but it had the once it got out there, it had the gantries on it where we worked on it and serviced it. It also had a hole in the bottom which the flames went through, and they pumped thousands of gallons of water in that when that thing lit off to keep it from melting all this stuff down. And also, if you notice, to deflect the sound away from any populated area out over the ocean. Because again, it would have probably put a lot of windows out in Cape Canaveral if they had pointed it the wrong way. Okay, next one, Cindy. Okay, this is the mobile launchers itself. This was designed by the Ohio Power Shovel Company, who before that had built the big shovels and stuff for the strip mine. When this thing was built, loaded with the Saturn on it and all that, it was the biggest thing to ever move on the Earth. Now, the stuff had moved on the ocean, big ships, but that was the biggest thing to ever move across the ocean. When they first built those ramps I was showing you to go to the pads out of concrete. When they tried to run this thing down that concrete, it crushed the concrete. The concrete wouldn't support it. So what they had to do, they went in and finally figured out that washed river gravel would support this thing. So they made a 3-foot thick layer of washed river gravel for that to roll on to get off the pad. An interesting point, that crushed river gravel is what we get out of the gravel pits out here in Morrisville. And you don't get that stuff in Florida. It only comes where there's outwashes from glaciers, so it has to come from southern Indiana, southern Illinois, something like that. I often wondered if some of that gravel didn't come from Orange County. I never could find out where they got it from, but I always thought some of it may have come from Orange County. These big cat tracks you see here, originally they designed them with ball bearings, and this thing was so heavy it flattened those bearings. So they had to go in and design some huge roller bearings to support this thing, because it was so heavy, it literally squished the... This thing also, as I said, it holds the area where what they call the flame buckets, and all this part here held all the equipment that tested and went to the umbilicals on this rocket. This is where that second computer I said we had was in this. It's in this facility right there. Okay. This is another picture of the Cape Kennedy Launch Complex. This area here is what they always call the celebrity box. TV always said that was celebrity box. There were celebrities in there, but there was also a lot of support engineers in this area that backed up the guys down here on this console. The people that was doing this checkout, they were experts at testing and checking and launching that rocket. But they weren't really experts on the equipment, the rocket itself, or what was launching. So they backed out NASA when they would have a launch. They had those guys backed up with engineers in this area. And then back at Marshall, they had what was called our Launch Support Center, which was the exact duplicate facility of this, only it was tied to those simulators I was talking to instead of the rockets, where they also had all the design engineers and engineering experts, so that if these guys had a problem, they would go to these guys and then back to Marshall, and they would decide whether they could launch it with the problem, whether they had to fix the problem and then launch it, or whether they had to scrub the whole thing and start over again. That's where those decisions were made for these people. Now, the final decision was made by other people up here, guys like Willard Von Braun and Rocco Petrone and those kind of guys. But and also, then on top of that, when they had to launch, even back at the contractors, they had design engineers and stuff standing by to back up even the Marshall people. So everybody that worked on the program was getting support from these guys when they were launching. Okay. Next one. All right. We finally got everything in place, got the rocks designed, and they started the test. We started to test them. They launched 3 rockets that tested the rock. First they tested the rocket, then they tested an Apollo module with nobody in it, and finally we got brave enough. They started to test the Apollo that was manned. They were doing a test called a plugs out test. And what that was they counted that rocket down with the astronauts in it all the way down to everything. They even dropped the umbilicals off, but they didn't light the engines. That's the only thing they didn't do was light the engines. The problem they got into was that inside this spacecraft, they were using, just like they were planning to do during the mission, a pure oxygen environment. The air in that was pure oxygen. Normally your air is 22% oxygen, 75% nitrogen. The reason they didn't use pure air and was using the rocket, they worried about what's called the bends. If you have a depressurization, when you got oxygen in your blood, that oxygen will turn to air. It'll vaporize, cause bubbles in your blood, and that causes all kinds of problems, brain damage, severe problems. Deep sea divers have the same problem. They call it the bends. So anyway, what happened here was, in that pure oxygen environment, they had an electrical spark. Now the reason they had that, they finally determined, they were doing, normally when you put 2 pieces of wire, you fasten the wires or make them on, you solder it. Well, they invented a whole new way of doing it. They call it a butt splice. They would take a metal tube, insulated metal tube, stick both ends of the wire in it, crimp them together, and real quickly you could make that exchange out and get soldered irons and all that stuff. Well, one of those, they didn't get crimped good, and when that circuit energized, that butt splice arc, when the butt splice arc, it set the insulation on fire. The minute that insulation went on fire, everything in that spacecraft that could burn started to catch on fire. If you've ever been in a chemistry class that had seen the teacher, they would take a beaker of oxygen, heat a steel piece of wire red hot, stick it in oxygen, it burns like a match. Well, that happened inside that spacecraft. The other problem was these doors to get in and out, the access doors, they had designed them to open in rather than out. And the idea was when you were out in empty space, and the pressurized inside the cabin, the pressure would force that door out, keep the spacecraft from leaking and make sure it didn't blow off and blow outside. But when that fire started, the pressure built up the spacecraft and they couldn't get the door open. So those astronauts were in there with the thing burning. Now, as it turns out, when they did the autopsies on them, they were in their spacesuits, and apparently the spacesuits protect them. They said that they didn't die from the fire. In fact, if they got the doors open, they might have been able to save them. They died from poison gas being generated by that insulation stuff in there burning. But anyway, this set the whole program back just about a whole year. Okay, so, no, leave it there. What they did then at that point in time, they called up a joint committee of contractors, astronauts, NASA wheels, everybody else, and they did a thorough, total top-down review of the whole program. They looked at all the procedures, they looked at everything. In fact, they called us at GE, told us to take all of our as-built drawings, which showed what our equipment was at the time this happened, lock them up in a vault and save them until that team could get there to look at them. But as a result of that, they ran a whole bunch of new procedures. Just an example, one of them they put in place was called single point failure analysis. You had to go through your design, look at everything you had in it, and if you found one thing in there that if it failed, it would scrub that, cause that launch to fail, you had to make it redundant, so it had to have two of them to fail. And if it happened to be a circuit that had something to do with the safety of the astronauts, you had to make it triple redundant, so three of them had to fail before you could have a failure. They also instituted what was called, they were doing this to some degree, but they really made this what was called a launch readiness review. Before each launch, each contractor had to go before this NASA board, which was made up of all the wheels of NASA, their engineers and all that, and make a detailed presentation on how his design was, how he designed it, what he did, how it worked, and if it was one of the later missions, any changes he'd made from the previous one, in front of all these people. They also, we did things that was called reliability analysis. I don't know how they did this, but somehow they made calculations that would tell us what the chance was that this thing was going to fail, and they had to go through all that details. After I got promoted to manager, I did that for General Electric in front of those NASA boards. That was one of the things I did. But okay, so next up. Finally, we got the thing back on schedule. We made 4 launches before we got to this one. This is the first launch to the moon here, they're showing you here. They launched the Apollo 4, which was a Saturn V. They just launched to make sure it was going to work. The next one we launched a lunar module to make sure it wasn't going to collapse when they got into space. Those lunar modules were, you look at them, they were real thin design. In fact, because you were going to be on the moon where there was no atmosphere and no gravity, they didn't have to be near as strong as they would be on Earth. You might have been able to kick a hole in the side of one of those things. I'm sure you could have dented it if you walked up and kicked it. But then they did a launch of the Apollo unmanned rocket, and then they got ready for the first manned. They used the first manned launch where they shot the Apollo module in Earth orbit around the Earth to test it. They had it up there for 11 days with astronauts in it. This was the type of program NASA did. Every step you tested it, you tested it, you tested it. Well, after we got the first manned launch around Earth tested, they looked at their schedule, and it became obvious that if we stayed on that schedule, there was no way they were going to make 1969. It just wasn't going to happen because we lost so much time with that fire. So NASA management made the decision to abort that test program and do a launch where they did about 3 or 4 launches, tests that they normally do together, and along with it to go to the moon. Now, the reason they didn't try to land then was the lunar module itself that was going to land on the moon wasn't ready to go yet, so they just went and did the orbit. And this was Apollo 208. That's the launch of it. And they put, okay, so go to the next one. I want to talk about this one. This is how Apollo 8 works. These are talking about. They first would launch the rocket, the whole spacecraft, put it in orbit around the Earth. Then they would fire a rocket, put it in a big parallel path, go around the moon, and then come back to the Earth. Now, that doesn't sound too difficult, but you stop and think about this. The first thing you got a spacecraft going around. Somebody had to calculate all the guidance equations and stuff needed to do this. You got a spacecraft going around the Earth at about 16,000 miles an hour. You got an Earth rotating, and it's going around the sun at a pretty high speed. And then you got the moon going around the Earth at a pretty high speed, and the whole thing moving through space. In addition to that, you got all kinds of things like the sun and other planets and stuff. You should put gravity force onto these spacecrafts as they go out there. Now somebody, and I never did figure out how these people could figure this out. They figured out how to launch this thing. You had to launch it at just the right time, because what we did, they put that thing into a big orbit that would go out around the Earth and the moon both. That orbit was that big. Now when you're doing orbital equations, if you want to go higher, you don't just fly higher. You make it go faster. If it goes faster, it goes up. If you want to slow it down, you slow it down and it comes down. It's like you swing a rubber ball on the end of a piece of rubber band. If you swing it fast, it goes out. If you slow it down, it comes back. So that's the way that orbital mechanics works. That's why with Apollo 13, when it blew up, when the rocket, the propulsion blew up in here someplace, they were able to go ahead, let it go around the moon, and come back to the Earth. because they didn't have enough power to turn it around and bring it back. Okay, somebody designed that equation, and I don't know how they did it, but that's what they did. And to us guys working on the program, this launch was really more important than the moon landing itself was, because that's where all that orbital equation was developed. MIT did that work. And all this, and the rocket itself was tested, because they originally worried about when they got these guys clear out in outer space, what was going to happen to that spacecraft. Would it hold up? Would it blow up? And I guess what? Not only that, you don't just go from the Earth and fly to the moon like you would go from New York City and fly to Los Angeles. You're going to go into an orbit and try to make that orbit come close as they wanted within 60 miles of the moon. To come within a point 60 miles of the moon, 283,000 miles away, moving at that speed, and not where it's at today, where it's going to be 4 days from now. So that's what that equation had to do to get them out there. Okay. Next one. Okay, this is a certificate I got. As I told you before, that was the launch that they went around the moon at Christmas time. This is a little something I got out of that. It's signed by Frank Borman. It says, I don't know, can you guys read that, or do I need to read it?
You read it.
Okay, I have to get around here. My eyes ain't that good.
You want me to read it now?
No, I can read it. It says, although many thousands of us have worked to make our manned space flight possible, only a few of us experience the incomparable travel in space. It seemed to us that there should be a way of providing those who worked on the progress some symbol of their efforts. We carried this first manned lunar flight in a small a small piece of aluminum. This piece of metal was melted down and incorporated to make this medallion, commemorative medallion, and I hope this will serve not only to give you a sense of active participation in this historic flight, but also to assure each of you of the appreciation of the astronauts Borman, Lovell, and Anders for the superior workmanship, conscientious performance, and dedicated to the safety of fellow human beings that made this a successful flight a reality, and do the same for the mission that remain ahead of us. Frank Borman. I have one of those medallions. It's in a book right there. Okay, after this one then, we went ahead and launched. In fact, on the back of that, if you read that, it says, in appreciation for your contribution to the Apollo Saturn project, the Apollo 8 crew carried a medal that's in this medallion to the moon and back on the Apollo on the moon. So that medal has been, the medal in that medallion has been around the moon. Okay, next one, Cindy. After all that, here's the biggie. This is Apollo 11. These are an emblem. Each launch had their own emblem. This happens to be the one for the Apollo 11. The one I got here. Once upon a time, I had some patches, a little bunch of those on them, but I'll tell that story later. Okay, we were finally ready for the moon launch. July 16th, 1969, at about 9:32 a.m. in the morning, Eastern Standard Time, we launched that thing. The crews had to go in the night before, about 10 o'clock, to start the final countdowns on this. They estimated at the time Apollo 11 launched, there was 1.5 million people on the beaches at Cocoa Beach and around. In fact, they were really worried that everybody was going to get there to support the launch. They might have to scrub the launch because there's so many people on the highways they couldn't get the launch crews there. But they did get there and it worked. Okay, everything, they launched it, everything worked well. Once you do the launch, the way it works, after the vehicle clears the launch pad and heads into orbit, Cape Canaveral turns the mission from the Cape Canaveral control centers over to the Houston control centers. Houston picks it up and they take it on from there. Everything at the Cape worked fine that night. In fact, everything went like clockwork. Everybody was really happy because we figured we'd put the man on the moon just like Kennedy wanted before the end of the 1960s. And it had been a struggle, but we felt like we made it. Okay, Cindy, next one. This is a picture of the launch control room after the launch. If you notice, all these guys have got cigars. That was something that got started during launches, that whenever we had a successful launch, they passed out cigars like we'd had a baby. Everybody got a cigar. And everybody was patting themselves on the back, having a great time. A lot of wheels there, Von Braun, a bunch of the others. They were all just as happy as everybody else, although as soon as we launched, they all ran out with their binoculars to make sure it really was working.
Were
And
they
it did.
Cuban cigars?
Huh?
Were they Cuban cigars?
You know, I don't remember. Probably. I wouldn't doubt it wasn't. Those guys did things like that. Okay, sitting next. This is something I got after that launch. It's from the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, I'll talk right in a minute, presents the Apollo Achievement Award to B.J. Schaefer. In recognition of dedicated service to the nation as a member of the team which has advanced the nation's capabilities in aeronautics and space and demonstrated that many outstanding accomplishments culminating in Apollo's successful achievement of man's first landing on the moon, July 20, 1969, signed by Thomas Paine, the head of NASA. Along with that, I got another medallion, this one here. That particular medallion has got a picture on the front of it of one of the astronauts, and I believe it was Aldrin, it might have been Armstrong, looking at the flag that they had just planted on the moon. On the back it says that this medallion contains metal from the spacecraft Columbia and Eagle that took astronauts Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins on their historic Apollo 11 mission that resulted in the first landing of man on the moon. So that's got metal from those spacecrafts in it. And I'm awfully proud to have that thing. Okay, Cindy, let's roll on here. I'm taking more time than I was hoping I would. All right. The next, after that, after the Apollo 11 launch, we went ahead and we launched Apollo 12, 13, 14, and 15. Apollo 12 was a manned landing that went 10 days on the moon. Apollo 13, you all know about it. It started off to be a manned landing, but it ended up being a lunar flyby because we had an explosion on the service module that was propelling that craft. That explosion occurred in an oxygen tank. By then they were about a third of the way to the moon. They did what they called stirring those tanks. Those tanks had liquid oxygen in them, but that oxygen would tend to solidify. So every now and then they would stir them, so it would really stir, so they wouldn't solidify. When they tried to stir it that one time, somehow it shorted and the oxygen tank blew up. Now, all the oxygen for the Apollo spacecraft was contained in that service module. The Apollo spacecraft itself only had enough oxygen and enough power for re-entry back into the Earth. When it was on the full mission, everything was coming from that service module. They also had fuel cells on the service module that generated electricity, and those fuel cells run with oxygen, so when they lost that oxygen, they lost electrical power, they lost everything. The reason we was able to get that thing back was, like I said, they had it on that big orbit, and they just let it go on out around the moon and come back to the Earth. Now, Houston got the idea, a guy named Glenn Looney, who was a test conductor down there, that the LEM itself had oxygen and power in it enough to last while it was sitting on the moon's surface several days. But the lunar excursion model was only designed for 2 people, and they had 3. But they could all get in it, but that just barely. But they all went down into the lunar module, turned off all the power and everything else in the Apollo spacecraft because they wanted to try to save enough in it that they could do re-entry when we got it back. And then they did some real deep study. You probably saw Apollo 13, studying on how they could save electricity and everything else, because when you put 3 people in that LEM, what it had, it wouldn't last as long as it would with 2 people. And part of the time they wouldn't even be in it. So anyway, that's what they did. They let that thing go all the way around and come back. And and as I was saying, somebody asked you earlier, they couldn't rotate because they didn't have all that power. They couldn't rotate that thing like they do. Normally what they did when that spacecraft was out in orbit, they would rotate it because the sun was shining on one side, and that was 250 degrees Fahrenheit plus. When it rolled over the other way and the sun wasn't shining on it, the temperature went to 250 degrees below zero. So they rotated it to maintain the temperature right. Well, when they couldn't rotate it so much, they let the temperature in that lunar module go down to between 32 degrees and 0, and those astronauts rode in that all the way around the moon and all the way back. I don't know how they kept them freezing there, but they did. They were tough guys, those guys were. Okay, But because of that, they were able to save that spacecraft. Now, they had to hold that. The reason they were so worried about that Apollo thing, number one, they wasn't sure it was going to start back up, which it did once they turned it back on. But the other thing, when you make a re-entry coming back from the moon, you have a very narrow window you got to come into. If you come in too high or too fast, that spacecraft will skip off the Earth's atmosphere, just like if you throw a rock across the pond and go off into outer space and who knows where, and there ain't no way you're going to turn around and bring it back. If you come in too low or too slow, it'll come into the atmosphere too fast, generate heat, and it'll burn up. So you have to hit this very narrow window at just exactly the right speed to get it into orbit around the Earth. Then they slow it down and let it sink back into the Earth until they can get it in a parachute. And the heat shield will protect it. But if they come in too fast, that heat shield won't protect it. So that happened. When they got it back, and most people consider that's the most successful mission they had, even though it was a failure, because they got those astronauts back. Okay, and then Apollo 14 was launched, and it lasted 10 days. It was launched in January of '71. Then we launched Apollo 15. It lasted 11 days. It was done in July of '71. That was the first mission to ever use one of the little rovers where they rolled around on the. These, by the way, are others. Each launch, the astronauts would give the people associated with the launch one of these, which they signed. You know, B.J. Schaefer actually going, sincere thanks for dedicated interest and support for the space program and Pacific L-15 being assigned to the astronaut. These are memorabilia that I've got and kept. I'm going to let the city whip through them so you can see them all. This one's the one for Apollo 16. And this, by the way, shows the emblems for all the launches. This is the last one. Again, Apollo 16 was another lunar launch. Apollo 17 was the last one we ever launched. After the Apollo 13 fire, Congress canceled the space program, canceled the Apollo program. It originally had been scheduled for 22 launches. They canceled it after 17. But so on 7 December 1972, 12-day mission, we did Apollo 17. Okay, keep going, Cindy. These I wanted to show you. Now that was the last one, by the way, and Cernan was the last guy to ever walk on the moon. These are, I want to show you these tapes. That's kind of a bad thing about me. These are tenant passes that they gave you to get onto the Spacecraft Center and Cape Kennedy for the launches. These particular ones for Apollo 17. I had these for practically all the rest of the launches, but I was there on and off on Cape during the testing of one time or another. For some reason, I kept these, I guess because the last one, I didn't keep the others. Not very long ago on Antique Roadshow, they said these things are worth about $1,000 or more a piece. But I had probably a dozen of them. I have a dozen of them, I don't know. In addition to that, I also had these monogram patches for Apollo 11 and several others. I had several of those. These they gave us, and people put them on their uniforms or jackets, the white coveralls they wore, and the astronauts put them, all kinds of things. I had those for Apollo 11 and most of the rest of the launches. I don't have them today. When I left Huntsville, went up to Iowa, my kids were in school. We sewed them on their jackets and let them wear to school. Let them wear them to school, and I don't know where they went. I don't have them. But anyway, again, Antique Roadshow said that those patches were worth anywhere from $5,000 to $10,000 a piece. I don't have any of them. We worked on the program, and we never dreamed that it was going to end in the first place. In the second place, I didn't think those things would ever be valuable, because I thought by today we'd be doing this in a regular routine. Who was suspected of being valuable? I didn't keep any of them, needless to say. Okay, Cindy, next one. This is Skylab. This is the last thing that we launched on the Apollo program. These are big solar panels that provide them electricity. There was an experiment on it called ATM, which was a telescope that they could look at outer space from outside, similar to the Galileos and stuff they got up there today that lets them take all those exotic pictures. That was about the last thing we did, because right after the Apollo fire in 1970, Congress canceled the program. They canceled the end of Apollo 17. At the time they canceled it, we had 5 complete rockets and 5 complete spacecrafts, all built, ready to launch, and they finally gave them away to museums. I don't know what they did with them. Let's see. Okay. They said they canceled that program to save money and so they could use the program for more important and better things. I don't think they probably saved much because those aerospace contracts all had cancellations in them, cancellation clauses. And those aerospace contractors, and we were too at GE, were experts at milking government contracts to get the money out of them. I'm sure they got every bit of money they would have ever got if it went all the way through the program. I'm sure they did. Then they gave us the Skylab contract to phase it down, which is what that was. I always felt that this was one of the biggest mistakes that Congress ever made. The computer development that occurred from Apollo alone more than paid for it, hundreds of times over. Because when they designed those, what I was talking about, that computers and the backups that they had at contractors and back at Marshall, et cetera, all those computers were set up so they would talk back and forth to each other. They would transfer data back and forth. You could set in the Launch Support Center at the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, put a code into a keypad on a table in an auditorium they had, and any measurement that they could see at the Cape would show up on that screen in Huntsville. You could look at exactly, if you want to know what the temperature of the oxygen was going into the engine, you put a code in and it would tell you. And it was clear in Huntsville. MIT developed all that, and the programs that they developed to do all this data transfer, talking between computers, etc., are the base programs that created the internet. That came from Apollo. Okay, luckily, well, when they canceled that, they laid off, they just started laying people off. We laid off all the people we had in Huntsville at the beginning of that program. There was thousands of engineers laid off. In fact, that layoff kicked off the Depression that was in 1973. I had a guy that lived next door to me who was manager of engineering for Boeing, who designed and built that Saturn V rocket. He got laid off and worked at a gas station for about 5 months before he found a job. Luckily for us, GE, and we did. We had the most talented bunch of people that I ever worked with in my life, 30 years, working on those programs. Any of them that wanted to go, they transferred to other divisions of General Electric. I got transferred to the Power Delivery Division of General Electric, where I developed the quality programs and the zero defect manufacturing programs for equipment going to nuclear power plants. I took a whole bunch of people from Huntsville with me when I went up there, and we sent a lot of people out of Huntsville to the nuclear power division down in San Jose to build nuclear power plants. All those, you still do that in those days. But anyway, a lot of the companies did it. The aerospace companies mainly laid all their people off. All that talent went on the street. And the knowledge that was generated in Apollo, when they went on the street, it went with them. They had us take all the drawings, all the procedures, computer programs, everything we did, put them in boxes, and ship them to a government storage facility in a cavern underneath Stone Mountain in Atlanta, Georgia. And as far as I know, they're still there today. Well, here we are, 50 years later, and we have never been back. And I guess all that money we saved was spent on something good, but I'm not sure what it was. And as far as our manned space program is concerned, we've got a space station that we put up there, but we can't get to it without buying a ticket on a Russian rocket. We don't have the capability to get to our own space station, and we have no capability to get into space anymore. Okay, finally, for all the non-believers that didn't believe in the program, and those people that don't believe we ever went there, we left that on the moon. That is to prove that in a time long ago and far away, the United States reached for the moon and we got there. Thank you. Sorry it took so long, but if anybody's got questions, I'd be happy to ask them.
Bill.
Yo.
As a 10-year-old boy, I was never more excited, and I have 50 years worth of questions. But
I may or may not be able to answer because my mind is not near as good as it was 50 years ago. I will tell you that.
Nevertheless, I do have a question. I remember watching a show about 20 years ago where they had placed on the moon mirrors just on the ground. And they shoot those mirrors with the lasers to measure. What do you know more about that? You know?
Well, yeah, I know they did that, and I can't remember exactly what it was they were measuring. They also put seismographs on there, and after those latter launches, when they got the moon rocket going the way they wanted, they fired that S-4B and crashed it into the moon to make the seismic measurements and that kind of stuff. But yeah, they did do that, and I'm not sure just why. I don't remember why. I probably did it one time. I don't remember why they did that. Yeah.
So the pads that they shot the Apollo rockets off of, were those the same pads that they shot the shuttles up in space with as well?
No. Well, the later shuttles, I think maybe they did. The shuttle, they used what had been a booster that was designed. The shuttle itself had engines on it, and then they had these solids on each side, but that main big booster in the middle with a big tank, that was a booster that had been designed for the Titan III Air Force mission, and it burned a real exotic fuel. It was unsymmetrical dimethylhydrazine mixed with benzene, and the oxidizer they used instead of oxygen was red fuming nitric acid. When that stuff was all combined, the fumes off of it, one part in about 5,000 or something like that was deadly if you got the smell. Anytime you worked on anything like that, they had to wear special suits and stuff. Wow. In fact, I was talking to a guy the other day. He had a friend that worked at Edwards where they were recovering that space shuttle when it landed there. And he said they went out there with big blowers and stuff and decontaminated that thing before they let anybody get to it because they're afraid some of that fuel might still be on there. But I'm not exact. They built special pads for that shuttle to launch it. Yeah.
You said at the time that when I talked to you the other day that you didn't really, basically you were just going to work. It was just a job. You realize now, 50 years later, how really cool it all was.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, you're right. At the time we were doing that, now we knew we were doing something special. We knew it was the first time we did that. But still, it was like we went to work every day. I didn't think that much about it, I really didn't think that much about it. It was my brother called me the other day, and he'd been watching one of these programs on television. He said, "Hey, brother," he said, "I was watching this program, and they were talking about the rockets they were doing now, and they said they were working on the technology from Apollo, and they were standing on the shoulders of giants." He said, "I didn't know you was a giant." I said, "I didn't either. I thought I was a fat engineer working on the space shuttle." Yes, sir.
I'd like to take a little credit for Joe's extreme success in the space program. Because when he was a senior at Illinois, and I was there too, some of his classes were pretty far apart. And I loaned him my bicycle so he could get there.
Yeah. I had one class that was at the business college on the very south end of the campus. I had another class in the ceramic engineering building all the way on the north end of the campus, and 10 minutes to get from one to the other, and I couldn't make it. So Art loaned me his bicycle so I could get back and forth to class.
Good. Oh, wow.
Any other questions?
Raconteur.
Okay, I've got here, I don't know, I'll set it over here if anybody wants to look at it. I've got some of the stuff you saw in some of those pictures in this scrapbook that I've kind of hung on to. One of some of the few things I was smart enough to keep. If anybody wants to look at it, I'll lay it over there so you can look at it.
Okay, let's give Mr. Schaefer.